What a beautiful day for a wedding.
Yes.
Wait a second, isn't that your poor ex-wife? I thought she was poor and barren. Why does she have beautiful triplets with her?
I stepped out of my white limousine, wearing a dress that cost more than my ex-husband's car, and watched his face turn ghost white when he saw me holding the hands of triplets who looked exactly like him. If you're ready to see the ultimate revenge story unfold, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happens next will blow your mind. My name is Jennifer. I'm 28 years old, and 3 years ago, I was sleeping on a friend's couch with 3 babies, eating ramen noodles for dinner, while my ex-husband Brian told the divorce court I was an unfit mother. Today, I own half of Manhattan's most expensive real estate, and Brian has no idea that the woman he threw away like garbage is about to destroy his perfect wedding day. The wedding was supposed to be Brian's crowning achievement. 500 guests at the mansion, marrying Sylvia, the blonde billionaire princess who represented everything he thought he deserved. What he didn't expect was for his discarded ex-wife to show up looking like she stepped off a magazine cover, accompanied by 3 6-year-old children who shared his exact same green eyes and dimpled chin. I watched him stumble backward as recognition hit him like a freight train. Emma, Tyler, and Grace stood beside me in matching designer outfits, their little hands gripping mine as hundreds of wedding guests turned to stare at the woman who had just crashed the party of the century. "Mommy, is that Daddy?" Emma whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden silence that fell over the perfectly manicured lawn. Brian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, Sylvia stood frozen in her $10,000 wedding dress, her blue eyes darting between me and the 3 children who were clearly Brian's biological children. 3 years ago, Brian had convinced the court that I was too poor and unstable to have custody of my own babies. He'd painted me as a desperate woman who would drag his children down into poverty. The judge believed him because Brian had money, lawyers, and a trust fund that made him look like the responsible parent. What Brian didn't know was that on the same day he took my children away from me, I made a phone call that would change everything. A phone call to someone who had been searching for me for 26 years. Someone whose blood ran through my veins and whose fortune was about to become mine. I smiled at Brian, the same sweet smile I used to give him when we were broke college students sharing instant coffee and dreams. Except now that smile held the power to destroy everything he'd built on my broken heart. "Hello, Brian," I said, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Thank you for the wedding invitation. I hope you don't mind that I brought our children to meet their new stepmother." The color drained from Sylvia's face as she stared at the 3 beautiful children who looked nothing like her and everything like the man she was about to marry. The crowd began to murmur. Phones came out, and I could practically hear the gossip spreading like wildfire through Manhattan's elite social circle. But this was just the beginning. Brian had no idea that the woman standing before him wasn't the same broken girl he'd abandoned. The woman he was looking at had spent 3 years planning this exact moment, and what was about to happen next would make his betrayal look like child's play. Because sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice, and sometimes the person you underestimate turns out to be the one holding all the cards. Brian was about to learn that destroying someone's life comes with consequences he never saw coming. The wedding music stopped playing, and in that perfect silence, my 6-year-old son Tyler looked up at Brian with those unmistakable green eyes and asked the question that would shatter everything. "Are you the daddy who didn't want us?" Tyler's innocent voice cut through the silence like a knife, and I watched Brian's perfect wedding day crumble in real time. The crowd gasped, and several women in expensive dresses covered their mouths in shock. Sylvia's bouquet dropped to the ground as she stared at the 3 children who had just revealed the ugly truth about the man she was about to marry. I squeezed Tyler's hand gently. My son had no idea he'd just delivered the most devastating blow possible, but his words carried the weight of 3 years of bedtime stories where I had to explain why Daddy couldn't visit, why Daddy couldn't call, and why Daddy had chosen his new life over them. I can explain, Brian stammered, but his voice cracked like a teenager going through puberty. Mrs. Adams, Sylvia's mother, and the woman who controlled the family fortune, stepped forward with ice in her eyes. Brian, darling, perhaps you could explain why 3 children who clearly share your DNA just called you daddy at your wedding to my daughter. The thing about rich people is they hate surprises, especially surprises that involve secret children and potential inheritance disputes. I could see the calculations running behind Mrs. Adams's cold blue eyes as she looked at Emma, Tyler, and Grace. My children stood there in their perfect outfits, looking like little angels who had just walked out of a fairy tale. What the crowd couldn't see was the 3 years of struggle that had brought us to this moment. The nights I worked double shifts while they slept in a friend's spare bedroom. The times I cried in bathroom stalls because I couldn't afford to buy them the toys other kids had. The court battles where Brian painted me as an unfit mother while his lawyers made me look like trailer trash. But that was before the phone call that changed everything. Sylvia, Brian said, reaching for his bride's hand, but she stepped back like he was diseased. Don't touch me, she hissed, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The wedding photographer kept snapping pictures, probably realizing he was documenting the most expensive disaster in Manhattan's social history. 500 guests stood frozen like mannequins, not sure whether to leave or stay for the show that was about to unfold. I had practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times, but seeing Brian's world collapse in real time was more satisfying than I had ever imagined. This was the man who had thrown me away like yesterday's newspaper. The man who had convinced a judge that his children would be better off without their mother in their lives. Mommy, why is everyone staring at us? Grace whispered, her tiny hand tugging at my designer dress. Because Daddy forgot to tell people about us, sweetheart, I said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Brian's best man, the same guy who used to eat pizza at our apartment when we were broke students, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Everyone who knew Brian during his struggling years knew about me and the children. They just never expected me to show up looking like I belonged in their world. Mrs. Adams pulled her daughter aside, and I could see them having a heated, whispered conversation. In the world of Manhattan elite, image is everything. And Brian had just become a liability that threatened their family's reputation. But here's what none of them knew yet. The phone call I made 3 years ago wasn't just about finding my biological father. It was about discovering that the scared 19-year-old girl who got pregnant in college was actually the heir to one of the biggest real estate empires in America. My father had been searching for the daughter he never knew existed, the daughter whose mother died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, the daughter who had been lost in the foster care system and grew up believing she had no family and no worth. Brian was about to learn that the woman he threw away wasn't just some poor girl who got lucky. I was Jennifer Thompson Miller, daughter of Robert Miller, and my net worth made his trust fund look like pocket change. Brian, I said sweetly, aren't you going to introduce your children to your new wife? Sylvia ripped off her engagement ring and threw it at Brian's feet so hard it bounced twice before landing in the fountain. The crowd erupted in gasps and shocked whispers as the 10-carat diamond disappeared beneath the water with a splash that echoed across the stunned silence. Brian dove after it like his life depended on it, his expensive tuxedo soaking through as he frantically searched the fountain's bottom. "The wedding is off!" Sylvia screamed, her voice carrying across the mansion's grounds. "I will not marry a man who abandoned his own children." Mrs. Adams nodded approvingly at her daughter's decision. In their world, a man who could throw away his own children was a man who couldn't be trusted with anything, especially not the Adams fortune. I watched Brian surface from the fountain, dripping wet and clutching the engagement ring, his perfect hair plastered to his head like a wet dog. 3 years ago, This same man had stood in court wearing his most expensive suit, telling a judge that I was too unstable and poor to raise our children properly. "Sylvia, please," he begged, water dripping from his designer tuxedo. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" she shot back. "Explain how you have 3 children you never mentioned? Explain how you convinced me you wanted to start a family when you already abandoned the family you had?" The wedding guests were pulling out their phones faster than reporters at a press conference. By tomorrow morning, this disaster would be trending on every social media platform in America. Brian, the man who thought he could rewrite history by erasing his first family, was about to become the most hated man on the internet. My children stood beside me, watching their father make a fool of himself in front of 500 people. Part of me wanted to protect them from seeing this, but another part of me knew they needed to see that the man who had abandoned them wasn't the powerful figure I'd built up in my mind. "Daddy looks silly," Emma giggled, and several guests nearby tried to hide their smiles. But what happened next would shock everyone, including me. Brian's mother, a woman I hadn't seen since the divorce, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face. Patricia had always been kind to me during our marriage, but she stayed silent when Brian threw me away. "My grandbabies," she whispered, dropping to her knees in front of Emma, Tyler, and Grace. "My beautiful grandbabies." She pulled them into a hug that was so desperate and loving that even I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Patricia had tried to contact me after the divorce, but Brian had threatened to cut her off financially if she maintained any relationship with me or the children. "I've missed you so much," she sobbed into their hair. "Grandma has thought about you every single day." The crowd watched in stunned silence as this elegant woman in her designer outfit cried over the grandchildren she'd been forced to abandon. Even some of the wedding guests were wiping away tears as they witnessed this heartbreaking reunion. Brian stood there dripping wet, holding a ring that no longer had any meaning, watching his mother choose his children over him. The same way he should have chosen his children over his pride 3 years ago. "Mom, get up!" Brian hissed under his breath. "You're making a scene." Patricia looked up at her son with disgust that could have melted steel. "I'm making a scene. You abandoned your own children and never told me where they were. You let me believe I'd never see my grandbabies again." That's when Mrs. Adams made an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned in her life. "Due to circumstances beyond our control, today's wedding has been canceled. The reception will continue for anyone who wishes to stay." But before anyone could move, she looked directly at me with curiosity in her cold eyes. "However, I believe we all deserve to hear the full story from the mother of these beautiful children. After all, if we're going to be gossiping about this for the next year, we might as well get our facts straight." 500 pairs of eyes turned to me, waiting for me to explain how a woman who had supposedly been too poor and unstable to raise her own children had just stepped out of a limousine wearing clothes that cost more than most people's cars. Brian's face went from red to white as he realized that his humiliation was just getting started. Because what I was about to reveal wouldn't just destroy his reputation, it would destroy everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd thrown away. I looked at the 500 faces staring at me, waiting for my story, and suddenly I was 19 again, standing in our tiny apartment bathroom, staring at 3 positive pregnancy tests while Brian studied for his business finals in the next room. Back then, we had nothing but love and big dreams. Brian worked nights at a gas station while I waited tables at a diner that smelled like grease and broken promises. We shared a studio apartment so small that our bed doubled as our couch, and we lived on ramen noodles and hope. "Jennifer, we can do this," Brian had said when I told him about the babies. "We'll figure it out together. I promise I'll never leave you." Those were the last honest words he ever spoke to me. The pregnancy was rough. Carrying triplets meant I couldn't work after my 5th month. So Brian picked up extra shifts while I grew bigger and more exhausted every day. We had no money for maternity clothes, so I wore his old t-shirts and sweatpants that barely fit over my enormous belly. But here's the thing about young love. It makes you believe that struggling together is romantic. I thought we were building something beautiful, something that would last forever. I was so naive. The babies came 2 months early. Emma, Tyler, and Grace, born tiny and perfect, spending their first weeks in the hospital while we slept in uncomfortable chairs and survived on vending machine food. Brian held my hand through all of it, whispering promises about the life we'd build for our children. Then his trust fund kicked in on his 25th birthday. Overnight, my struggling boyfriend became a millionaire. The man who used to count quarters for laundry money suddenly had access to more money than we'd ever dreamed of. And that's when everything changed. "We need to talk about our future," he said one morning, but he wouldn't look me in the eyes. Mrs. Adams's voice pulled me back to the present. "Well, are you going to tell us your story or not?" I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of the designer dress that cost more than Brian's monthly rent back when we were happy. "You want the truth? I'll give you the truth." The crowd leaned forward, hungry for gossip that would feed their social circles for months. But they had no idea they were about to witness something much bigger than a wedding scandal. 3 years ago, I was exactly what Brian told everyone I was: poor, desperate, and supposedly unfit to raise my own children. But what he didn't tell the court was that he abandoned us the moment money became more important than family. Brian started walking toward me, probably hoping to stop me from saying more, but his mother, Patricia, grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Let her speak," Patricia said firmly. "These people deserve to know what kind of man my son really is." The betrayal in Patricia's voice was devastating. This woman had raised Brian to be better than this, and watching her choose his children over him was almost as satisfying as watching Sylvia throw that ring in the fountain. I looked directly at Brian, remembering the night he packed his bags while Emma, Tyler, and Grace slept in their cribs. The man you all know as Brian started as a broke college student who promised me forever. But the moment he inherited his family money, he decided that a woman like me wasn't good enough for his new lifestyle. Several women in the crowd whispered angrily to their husbands. Even among Manhattan's elite, abandoning your children was considered unforgivable. "So he took my babies from me," I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. "He convinced a judge that I was unstable, that I couldn't provide for them. He painted me as a desperate woman who would drag his children down into poverty." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Even the wedding photographer had stopped taking pictures, too absorbed in the drama unfolding before him. But what Brian never bothered to learn about the woman he threw away was that some people are stronger than he ever imagined, that some people don't stay broken forever. That's when I pulled out my phone and made the call that would destroy Brian's world completely. "Hello." "Daddy," I said into the phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's time." Brian's face went completely white as he watched me make that call, because what happened next would prove that karma isn't just a concept. Sometimes it's a billionaire with an army of lawyers and 3 years of rage to fuel the most spectacular revenge anyone had ever witnessed. Through the phone, I could hear cars pulling up the mansion's driveway. Expensive cars. Lots of them. "What's happening?" Sylvia whispered, but her mother was already looking toward the sound of approaching vehicles with growing alarm. That's when my biological father, Robert Miller, stepped out of a black Rolls-Royce, followed by 6 men in expensive suits who looked like they could buy and sell everyone at this wedding without breaking a sweat. The moment Robert Miller walked onto that wedding reception, the entire energy of the crowd shifted like someone had just flipped a switch. 500 wealthy people suddenly looked like school children who had been caught misbehaving by the principal. You see, Robert Miller wasn't just rich. He was Manhattan royalty. The kind of man whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The kind of man who could make or break political careers with a single phone call. And he was walking straight toward me with a smile that could have melted ice. "My darling daughter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd as he pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home after 26 years of being lost. The gasps from the wedding guests were so loud they probably heard them in New Jersey. Mrs. Adams looked like she was about to faint, and Brian's mouth was hanging open so wide that flies could have nested in there. But this moment wasn't just about shocking a bunch of rich people at a wedding. This was about Emma, Tyler, and Grace finally meeting the grandfather who had been searching for them their entire lives. "Grandpa," Emma whispered, her little voice full of wonder, as Robert knelt down to her level. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm your grandpa, and I've been looking for you and your mommy for so very long." The three men who had stepped out of the second car weren't just bodyguards, they were lawyers. The best lawyers money could buy. And they were carrying briefcases that contained documents that would change everything Brian thought he knew about custody battles and financial power. "Jennifer," Robert said, standing back up and keeping one hand on Emma's shoulder, "I believe we have some business to discuss with your ex-husband." Brian looked like he was about to throw up. 3 years ago, he'd fought me in court using expensive lawyers his trust fund could afford. But now he was facing the legal team that had never lost a case in 30 years of practice. The head lawyer, a woman named Linda Chen, who looked like she could argue with God and win, stepped forward with a folder thick enough to use as a weapon. "Mr. Bryan," she said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel, "we need to discuss the illegal custody arrangement that was obtained through fraudulent financial statements and deliberate misrepresentation of my client's circumstances." "I don't know what you're talking about," Brian stammered, but sweat was pouring down his face like a waterfall. "Oh, but I think you do," Linda continued, opening her folder. "You see, when you convinced that judge that Jennifer was financially unstable and unfit to parent her children, you failed to mention that you knew she was the biological daughter of Robert Miller. You also failed to mention that you had deliberately hidden her inheritance from her for 3 years. The crowd erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. This wasn't just about a custody battle anymore. This was about fraud, lies, and a level of betrayal that even Manhattan's gossip-hungry elite found shocking. Mrs. Adams stepped forward, her face pale as paper. "Robert, I had no idea that this woman was your daughter. If you had known, you would have treated her with the respect she deserved, instead of allowing your future son-in-law to humiliate her at your family event," Robert said coldly. But here's where things got really interesting. Brian wasn't just facing the loss of his bride and his reputation. He was about to learn that the woman he'd thrown away was now worth more money than his entire family had ever seen. "Jennifer," Robert said, turning to me with pride in his eyes, "I think it's time these people learned exactly who you are." I nodded, feeling a power I'd never experienced before. For 3 years, I'd been the poor ex-wife who wasn't worth Brian's time. Now I was about to reveal that I controlled more wealth than everyone at this wedding combined. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes with unlimited resources, "allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Thompson Miller, sole heir to Miller Industries, which owns 40% of Manhattan's commercial real estate, including the building where Brian's law firm rents their offices." The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Brian's face went through about 17 different shades of white as he realized what I was saying. "That's right, Brian," I continued, savoring every word. "The woman you convinced the court was too poor to raise her own children now owns the building where you work. The woman you threw away like garbage is now your landlord." But the real shock was yet to come, because what I said next would destroy Brian's life more completely than anything that had happened so far. Linda Chen smiled like a shark that had just spotted blood in the water. Mr. Brian, we're here to inform you that as of tomorrow morning, your custody rights are being terminated and you're being sued for 3 years of unpaid child support, emotional damages, and fraudulent misrepresentation in family court. Brian collapsed into a chair like his legs had stopped working, but the worst part was still coming, because at that exact moment, my phone buzzed with a text message that would turn this revenge from satisfying to absolutely devastating. A message that would prove that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice so perfect it's almost scary. The text was from Brian's boss at the law firm, and it said exactly what I'd been hoping it would say for 3 long years. I looked down at my phone and couldn't help but smile as I read the message that would be the final nail in Brian's coffin. Brian, you're fired. Don't bother coming in Monday. Security will pack your office. You see, 3 months ago, when I discovered that Miller Industries owned the building where Brian worked, I'd made a very strategic phone call to his boss, Mr. Peterson. Not to get Brian fired. That would have been too easy. No, I wanted Brian to destroy himself, and today's wedding disaster had given Peterson exactly the excuse he needed. Brian, I said, holding up my phone so he could see the screen, I think you have a text message to read. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone, but when he read that message, the last bit of color drained from his face. He wasn't just losing his bride, his reputation, and his children. He was losing his entire career. You did this, he whispered, looking at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Actually, you did this, I replied calmly. I just owned the building. You're the one who decided to abandon your children and humiliate their mother at a public wedding. Peterson doesn't want that kind of man representing his law firm. The wedding guests were recording everything on their phones, and I could already imagine the headlines that would be trending by tonight. Manhattan lawyer loses everything after wedding day scandal, or billionaire heiress gets ultimate revenge on ex-husband. But the most beautiful part wasn't Brian's humiliation. It was watching my children finally understand that their mother wasn't the weak, broken woman their father had painted her to be. Mommy, Tyler said, tugging on my dress, are you really rich now? We're rich, sweetheart, I corrected gently. All of us together. Emma looked up at Robert with those big green eyes that reminded me so much of Brian when he was still a good man. Grandpa, does this mean we don't have to live in the small apartment anymore? Robert knelt down and pulled all 3 children into his arms. My darlings, you're going to live in the biggest house you've ever seen, with your own rooms and a playground in the backyard. And you're never going to have to worry about money, or food, or having enough toys ever again. Patricia, Brian's mother, was watching this exchange with tears streaming down her cheeks. She walked over to Robert and extended her hand with dignity that her son had never possessed. Mr. Miller, she said formally, I want you to know that I tried to stay in touch with Jennifer and the children after the divorce, but Brian threatened to cut me off financially if I maintained contact. I've regretted that decision every day for 3 years. Robert studied her for a moment, then shook her hand firmly. Mrs. Patricia, you're welcome to be part of these children's lives anytime you want. They need all the love and family they can get. The generosity in that gesture made even some of the hardened Manhattan socialites wipe away tears. Here was a man who had every right to be angry at Patricia for staying silent, but instead he was choosing forgiveness and thinking about what was best for the children. Brian watched this exchange with growing desperation. His mother was choosing his children over him. His bride had thrown her ring in a fountain. His career was over, and now his ex-wife was being welcomed into Manhattan's highest social circles while he became a pariah. This isn't over, Brian said, trying to sound threatening, but mostly sounding pathetic. Linda Chen, the lawyer who looked like she could destroy nations before breakfast, smiled at Brian like he was a particularly stupid child. Oh, but it is over, Mr. Brian. You see, we've spent the last 3 years building an airtight case against you. Fraudulent custody claims, hiding assets, emotional damage to the children, and now public humiliation that's being broadcast live on social media. She was right about the social media part. I could see dozens of guests live streaming the entire disaster, and the comments were pouring in faster than anyone could read them. Brian was about to become the most hated man in America, and he'd done it all to himself. Sylvia, who had been standing in stunned silence while her perfect wedding day turned into a legal nightmare, finally found her voice. I want him off my family's property, she said to her mother. Now, Mrs. Adams nodded and gestured to the security guards who had been standing discreetly around the perimeter of the reception. Please, escort Mr. Brian from the premises. But as the security guards approached him, Brian did something that shocked everyone, including me. Something so desperate and pathetic that it would haunt him for the rest of his life and give me a memory I would treasure forever. He dropped to his knees in his soaking wet tuxedo in front of 500 people and countless phone cameras and began to beg. Jennifer, please, Brian sobbed, his voice cracking like a broken teenager. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I love you. I love our children. Please don't do this to me. The silence that followed his pathetic display was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. 500 wealthy people stood frozen, watching a grown man grovel in the dirt, while his children stared at him with confusion and embarrassment. But here's the thing about begging for forgiveness. It only works if the person you hurt believes you're genuinely sorry. And after 3 years of watching my babies cry themselves to sleep asking why Daddy didn't want them, I knew exactly what Brian's apology was worth. Nothing. You love us? I asked, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. You love the children you told a judge were better off without their mother? You love the family you abandoned the moment money became more important than people? Brian was still on his knees, his expensive wedding suit soaked through and covered in mud from the fountain incident. Tears and snot were streaming down his face, and every second of his breakdown was being recorded by dozens of phones. I was young and stupid, he pleaded. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I thought you'd be happier without me holding you back. The lies just kept coming, even now, even when he had nothing left to lose. Brian couldn't help himself. He was still trying to rewrite history to make himself look like the victim. Daddy, why are you crying? Grace asked, her little voice full of innocence that broke my heart. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that their father is crying because he finally realized that actions have consequences? How do you tell a child that their daddy is begging because he threw away the most precious things in his life and now he can't get them back? He's crying because he's sad. Sweetheart, I said gently, kneeling down to Grace's level. Sometimes adults make very bad choices and then they feel sorry about it later. Robert stepped forward, his presence commanding respect even in this circus atmosphere. Mr. Brian, I think it's time for you to leave with whatever dignity you have left. But Brian wasn't done humiliating himself yet. No, wait, he gasped, crawling toward me on his hands and knees like some kind of desperate animal. Jennifer, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please don't take my children away from me. I'll do anything. I'll give you anything. Just please let me be part of their lives. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as this man who had once stood proud and arrogant in a courtroom, taking children away from their mother, now begged that same woman for mercy. If you're watching this and you've ever wondered what real karma looks like, make sure you subscribe to this channel because what I'm about to tell Brian next will restore your faith in justice. I looked down at this broken man who had once been everything to me, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not satisfaction, not joy, not even anger. I felt pity. Brian, I said quietly. 3 years ago, you stood in a courtroom and told a judge that I was unfit to be a mother. You painted me as a desperate, unstable woman who would drag your children down into poverty. You took my babies away from me and made them believe their mother didn't want them. He was still sobbing, still on his knees, still hoping that somehow his tears would undo 3 years of abandonment and cruelty. You had your chance to be a father, I continued. You had your chance to choose love over money, family over status, children over pride, and you chose wrong every single time. Patricia, Brian's mother, watched her son's complete breakdown with a mixture of shame and heartbreak. She'd raised him to be better than this, and watching him grovel in the mud was probably the most painful thing she'd ever witnessed. The custody arrangement stands as the court decided, Linda Chen announced, her voice cutting through Brian's sobs like a blade. Mr. Brian has visitation rights, supervised by the state, assuming he passes the psychological evaluation we've requested. Brian's head snapped up, hope flickering in his desperate eyes. Visitation? You mean I can still see them? That depends entirely on you, I said firmly. If you can prove to a court-appointed psychologist that you're mentally stable and genuinely committed to being a father, not just when it's convenient for you, then yes, you might be allowed supervised visits. The hope in his eyes was pathetic and heartbreaking at the same time. 3 years ago, he'd had everything: a loving wife, beautiful children, and a future full of possibilities. Now he was begging for scraps of time with the family he'd thrown away. But what I said next would either give Brian the motivation to become a better man or destroy him completely. Because sometimes, real justice isn't about revenge, it's about giving someone exactly what they deserve, whether that's punishment or a chance at redemption. Brian, I said, looking down at him with more kindness than he'd ever shown me. If you want to earn the right to be in your children's lives, you need to prove that you've learned what it means to put someone else before yourself. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word of this final judgment. You need to show Emma, Tyler, and Grace that their father is someone worth knowing, not someone who abandons his family when times get tough, but someone who fights for the people he loves. Brian nodded frantically, clinging to this tiny thread of hope like a drowning man grabbing a rope. But then I delivered the words that would change everything for both of us, forever. But first, you're going to spend the next year working at a homeless shelter, helping single mothers who are in the exact same situation you put me in 3 years ago. Brian's face went blank with shock. The crowd started murmuring, not sure if they'd heard me correctly. Even Linda Chen looked surprised at my condition. You're going to spend 40 hours a week helping women who have nothing, who are struggling to feed their children, who are fighting custody battles they can't afford. You're going to see exactly what you tried to do to me, and you're going to help fix it for other families. I could see the wheels turning in Brian's head. He'd expected to write a check, maybe attend some therapy sessions, and get his children back. He hadn't expected to be sentenced to actually understanding the pain he'd caused. Jennifer, that's not what he started, but I cut him off. That's not what, Brian? That's not convenient for you? That's beneath someone of your social status? My voice got harder with each word. Those women you'll be helping are exactly who you try to turn me into, poor, desperate, and fighting for their children against men who have more money and better lawyers. The crowd was dead silent now. Some of the wealthy women in designer dresses looked uncomfortable, probably wondering how many times they'd looked down on struggling mothers without realizing those women could have been them in different circumstances. Robert placed his hand on my shoulder with pride. My daughter is showing you more mercy than you deserve, son. If it were up to me, you'd never see those children again. Brian was still on his knees, but now he looked terrified instead of hopeful. The idea of actually working with poor people, of getting his hands dirty helping families he'd always looked down on, was clearly horrifying to him. And, I continued, because I wasn't finished destroying his comfortable little world, you're going to donate half of your trust fund to organizations that help single mothers with legal fees. Patricia gasped. Mrs. Adams looked impressed despite herself. Even some of the wedding guests who'd been filming everything lowered their phones in shock. Half of my trust fund? Brian's voice cracked. Jennifer, that's millions of dollars. Yes, it is, I said calmly. It's also a fraction of what you cost me in emotional damage, lost time with my children, and legal fees fighting your lies in court. Linda Chin was writing everything down, probably already drafting the legal documents that would make Brian's punishment official. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice with a purpose. If you complete 1 full year of service, donate the money as promised, and pass psychological evaluation proving you understand what you did wrong, then you can apply for supervised visitation with Emma, Tyler, and Grace. Tyler looked up at me with confusion in his little green eyes. Mommy, what does that mean? I knelt down to his level, wanting him to understand that this wasn't about hurting his father, but about making sure his father became someone worth knowing. It means Daddy has to prove he's learned how to be a good person before he can spend time with you again, I explained gently. Like when I have to clean my room before I can play with my toys, Emma asked. Exactly like that, sweetheart. Daddy has to clean up the mess he made before he can play with his family again. The simplicity of a child's understanding made several people in the crowd wipe away tears. Even Brian seemed to finally grasp what he'd lost, seeing his children talk about him like he was a stranger who needed to earn their trust. Sylvia, who had been standing in shocked silence through this entire ordeal, stepped forward in her ruined wedding dress. I want everyone here to witness what just happened, she announced to the crowd. This woman just gave her ex-husband, the man who abandoned her and their children, a chance to redeem himself. She could have destroyed him completely, but instead she's offering him a path back to his family. The crowd started clapping, slowly at first, then building to thunderous applause. They weren't just applauding the drama they'd witnessed. They were applauding genuine justice, mercy, and wisdom. But Brian wasn't clapping. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You really think I'm going to work in a homeless shelter? He asked, his voice full of disbelief and growing anger. You think I'm going to give away half my money and grovel for a year just to see my own children? The crowd stopped clapping. The silence stretched out like a held breath. I think, I said quietly, you're going to show us all exactly who you really are. Because this was the moment of truth. The moment when Brian would either choose his children over his pride or prove once and for all that he valued money and status more than being a father. His answer would determine not just his future, but how Emma, Tyler, and Grace would remember their father for the rest of their lives. Brian stood up slowly, mud and water dripping from his expensive suit, and looked around at the 500 people waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Then he opened his mouth and said the words that would seal his fate forever. You know what, Jennifer? I'm not going to humiliate myself working with homeless people and throwing away my inheritance just to see my own children, Brian said, his voice getting stronger and more arrogant with each word. I'll find another way. I'll appeal the custody decision. I'll hire better lawyers. The crowd gasped in collective shock. Even after everything that had happened, even after losing his bride, his job, and his reputation, Brian was still choosing his pride over his children. Emma, Tyler, and Grace looked up at their father with confusion and hurt in their eyes. They were too young to understand the legal implications of what he just said, but they were old enough to know that Daddy was choosing to stay away from them. Daddy doesn't want to work hard to see us? Tyler asked, his little voice breaking my heart into 1,000 pieces. Patricia stepped forward, her face twisted with shame and disgust. Brian, what is wrong with you? These are your children, your babies, and you're choosing money over them? Again. But Brian was beyond reason now. The humiliation of the day had twisted into anger, and he was lashing out at everyone who had witnessed his downfall. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," he declared, gesturing wildly at the crowd. "I'm not going to let my ex-wife dictate the terms of my relationship with my own children. I'll see them when I want, how I want, and I won't be manipulated into giving away my inheritance to do it." Robert Miller stepped forward, his face hard as granite. "Son, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Did I?" Brian laughed bitterly. "Or did I just refuse to be blackmailed by a woman who got lucky and found a rich father?" The insult hung in the air like poison. After everything I'd offered him, mercy, a path to redemption, a chance to earn back his children's love, Brian had chosen to attack me one more time. Linda Chen closed her briefcase with a sharp click that echoed across the silent reception. "Mr. O'Brien, you have just voluntarily terminated any future possibility of custody or visitation rights. This conversation has been recorded by multiple witnesses and will be presented to the family court judge tomorrow morning." "Good," Brian snapped. "I don't want to see those kids anyway. They're probably not even mine." The moment those words left his mouth, I watched something die in Patricia's eyes. The last bit of love and hope she'd held for her son vanished like smoke. Emma started crying. Not the loud, dramatic tears of a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of a child who finally understands that their parent doesn't love them. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on my dress, "why doesn't Daddy want us?" I picked up my daughter, holding her close as her little body shook with grief. Tyler and Grace pressed against my legs, seeking comfort from the parent who had never abandoned them. "Because, sweetheart," I said gently, "Daddy is sick in his heart. He loves money more than he loves people, and that makes him very, very sick." Brian looked around at the crowd of 500 people, all staring at him with disgust and horror. These were Manhattan's elite, people who valued money and status above almost everything. And even they were appalled by his cruelty toward his own children. "You're all hypocrites," he said desperately. "You all care more about money than family. You all make business decisions that hurt people. At least I'm honest about it." But his words fell flat. There's a difference between being ruthless in business and abandoning your own children twice in the same day. Mrs. Adams stepped forward, her voice cold as ice. "Security, please escort this man off my property immediately and make sure the gates know he's never to be allowed back." As the security guards approached, Brian made one last desperate play for sympathy. "Patricia, Mom, you're not going to let them do this to me, are you? I'm your son." Patricia looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "No, Brian. You stopped being my son the moment you said you didn't want those beautiful children. Emma, Tyler, and Grace are my grandchildren, and they are more important to me than you will ever be again." She turned her back on him and walked over to where Robert was gently comforting the crying children. "Mr. Miller," she said formally, "if you'll allow me, I would like to be part of my grandchildren's lives. I know I failed them before by staying silent, but I promise you, I will never fail them again." Robert studied her face for a moment, then nodded with respect. "Mrs. Patricia, these children need all the love and family they can get. You're welcome in their lives anytime." The security guards took Brian by the arms, but he shook them off angrily. "I don't need your help," he snarled. "I can walk myself out of this circus." As he stalked toward the parking lot, still dripping wet and covered in mud, 500 people watched in silence. Nobody felt sorry for him. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody called out for him to reconsider. Brian had made his choice, and now he would live with the consequences forever. But as he reached the edge of the reception area, he turned back one last time and shouted something that would haunt me for years to come, even though I knew I'd done everything right. "You'll regret this, Jennifer. Those kids will grow up knowing their mother destroyed their family. They'll hate you for keeping me away from them." His words cut through the air like broken glass, and for a moment, doubt crept into my heart. What if he was right? What if Emma, Tyler, and Grace would blame me someday for driving their father away? But then Tyler looked up at me with those beautiful green eyes and said something that made everything clear. "Mommy, why's the mean man yelling at you?" The mean man. Not daddy. Not father. Brian had become a stranger to his own children in the span of a single afternoon, and it was entirely his own doing. "Because he's angry that he can't have what he threw away, sweetheart," I said, smoothing Tyler's hair. "Sometimes when people make bad choices, they get mad at everyone except themselves." Robert stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never lost a battle that mattered. "Mr. Bryan, you are trespassing on private property and threatening my daughter. Leave now, or I'll have you arrested." Brian looked around one last time at the crowd of people who had witnessed his complete destruction. His expensive suit was ruined, his reputation was in tatters, his career was over, and he had voluntarily given up any claim to his children. "This isn't over," he said weakly, but everyone could see it was just empty bluster from a broken man. "Yes, it is," I said firmly. "It's been over for 3 years, Brian. You just finally figured it out." Security escorted him to his car, and we watched as Brian drove away from the wedding that was supposed to be his triumph, alone and defeated. The crowd stood in stunned silence for a moment, processing everything they had witnessed. Then, slowly, people began to approach me. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen," whispered one woman in a Chanel dress. "You showed him more mercy than he deserved," said another guest, shaking her head in amazement. But the most important conversation was happening between my children and their new grandfather. "Grandpa," Grace asked, climbing onto Robert's lap, "are we going to live in a castle now?" Robert laughed, the first genuine joy anyone had heard all day. "Not a castle, sweetheart, but a very big house with everything you could ever want." "Will Mommy be happy there?" Emma asked, always thinking of others first. "Mommy will be very happy there," Robert assured her, "because Mommy will be with the 3 most important people in her world." "Mrs. Adams approached us looking embarrassed and regretful. "Jennifer, I owe you an apology. When you arrived today, I assumed wrong about everything." "It's okay," I said gracefully. "You were protecting your daughter from what you thought was a gold digger." "I understand that." "No, it's not okay," she insisted. "I should have seen the kind of man Brian really was. Sylvia deserves better, and so did you." Sylvia joined her mother, still wearing her ruined wedding dress but looking relieved rather than devastated. "Actually, I think this was the best wedding gift I could have received. Better to find out what kind of man he is now than after we were married." She looked down at Emma, Tyler, and Grace, who were playing with the fountain coins that wedding guests had thrown for luck. "Your children are beautiful, Jennifer. They're lucky to have a mother who fought so hard for them." As the sun began to set over the mansion grounds, most of the wedding guests had gone home with the gossip story of the century. But the people who mattered, my children, my father, and even Patricia, gathered around the fountain where Brian had humiliated himself just hours earlier. "What happens now?" Patricia asked, watching her grandchildren with eyes full of love and regret. "Now we go home," I said simply. "We go to our real home, with people who love us, and we start living the life we deserve." Robert stood up, brushing off his expensive suit. "The cars are waiting whenever you're ready, Jennifer. Your new life is about to begin." I looked around at the mansion grounds where I had achieved the perfect revenge, but realized that revenge wasn't what made me happy. What made me happy was watching Emma, Tyler, and Grace laugh and play without fear, without wondering if they were wanted, without crying themselves to sleep missing a father who never deserved them. Brian had invited his poor ex-wife to his wedding to disgrace her, and instead, he had disgraced himself so completely that he would never recover. But more importantly, he had freed his children from the burden of trying to earn love from someone who wasn't capable of giving it. As we walked toward the limousines that would take us to our new life, Tyler looked back at the mansion one more time. "Mommy, are we ever going to see Daddy again?" I knelt down and hugged all three of my children close, breathing in their sweet smell and feeling grateful for every second I got to spend with them. "I don't know, sweetheart. That's up to him. But I know that whether we see him again or not, you three are going to grow up knowing that you are loved, wanted, and cherished every single day of your lives." "By you and Grandpa and Grandma Patricia?" Grace asked. "By all of us," I confirmed, "forever and always." I want you to give a detailed descriptive image prompt for each of the paragraph of the story. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in justice and second chances, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who never gave up fighting for what mattered most. And remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone else. It's building a beautiful life they can never touch. We climbed into the limousine that had started this whole adventure, but this time we weren't going to a wedding. We were going home, to a life where my children would never again have to wonder if they were wanted. And as we drove away from the ruins of Brian's perfect day, I realized that sometimes the universe doesn't just give you justice, it gives you everything you never dared to dream you deserved. The little girl who grew up in foster care, who got pregnant at 19 and struggled to feed her babies, who fought for 3 years to prove she was worthy of her own children. That girl was finally going home. And this time, no one could ever take it away from us again.